The Boeing 737 hummed with that familiar pre-flight tension as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, wrestling oversized carry-ons into stubborn overhead bins. I pressed myself against the window in seat 14A, watching ground crews scurry like ants around the aircraft's belly, their orange vest bright against the gray Seattle morning. The coffee in my paper cup had gone cold an hour ago, but I held on to it anyway, needing something to occupy my hands as my older brother Marcus settled into the middle seat beside me. "Still can't believe you're flying commercial," Marcus said, his voice carrying that edge of condescension I'd grown up hearing. He adjusted his designer suit jacket and checked his Rolex, the same theatrical gestures he'd been making since he landed his big-shot attorney job in Manhattan. "What happened to all those military perks you used to brag about? Thought you flyboys got special treatment." I kept my eyes on the tarmac, watching a fuel truck maneuver between two parked jets. "I'm not active duty anymore, Marcus. You know that." Right. The great Captain Jake Sullivan, reduced to flying coach like the rest of us mortals. He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mom always said you'd come back down to earth eventually." The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, running through the standard safety demonstration that most passengers ignored. I automatically noted the emergency exits, old pilot habits. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like legal documents. I was talking to the partners at dinner last week about my little brother, the pilot. I had to explain why you're not flying anymore. Kind of embarrassing, really." "I never stopped flying." The words came out sharper than I intended. A young mother in the row ahead turned slightly at my tone, her toddler squirming in her arms. I lowered my voice. "I just don't fly for the Air Force anymore." "Same difference," Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Point is, you had something good going, and you threw it away. Classic Jake move, honestly. Remember when you quit Little League right before the championship, or when you dropped out of pre-med?" My jaw tightened. 28 years old, and he could still push my buttons like we were kids fighting over the last slice of pizza. Those situations were different. Were they? Seems like a pattern to me. You start something, show some promise, then bail when things get tough. He leaned back in his seat, satisfied with himself. "At least this time you didn't stick the family with the fallout. Though I'm sure Dad's still disappointed you gave up on the military career. All that money for flight school, all those years of training." The engine spooled up with a deep, thrumming vibration that I felt in my chest. I'd experienced that sensation thousands of times, but always from the cockpit, always in control. Being a passenger felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. Through the small window, I watched the wing flex slightly as we began to taxi, the mechanics of flight as familiar to me as breathing. "You're being dramatic," I said, not looking at him. "People change careers all the time." "Sure, but most people don't walk away from being a decorated fighter pilot." He gestured vaguely at my civilian clothes. "What exactly are you doing now? Mom mentioned something about consulting work?" "Flight instruction, some consulting on aviation safety protocols." I pulled my boarding pass from my shirt pocket, smoothing out the wrinkled edges. "It's good work." Snort. Teaching weekend warriors how to fly Cessnas? Real step up from flying F-16s, I'm sure. The woman in front of us was struggling with her seatbelt while trying to keep her restless child from kicking the seat. Her husband was buried in his laptop, oblivious to her obvious stress. I watched her jaw tighten with frustration, the same expression I'd seen in the mirror countless times when dealing with Marcus. "At least I'm still in aviation," I said. "Some of us care about more than just the size of our paychecks." "Oh, here we go. Saint Jake, too noble for filthy money." Marcus's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby passengers. "You know what your problem is? You think the world owes you something just because you wore a uniform for a few years." 8 years, and I never said. 8 years of taxpayer-funded flying lessons, and what do you have to show for it? You're 30 years old, living in some studio apartment, teaching rich kids how to do barrel rolls. Meanwhile, I'm pulling down 7 figures, buying Mom and Dad that house in Florida they always wanted. The child in front of us started crying, a sharp wail that cut through the cabin noise.
Her husband was bouncing him frantically, whispering soothing words that weren't working. Her husband finally looked up from his screen, annoyed rather than helpful. "Can you keep him quiet?" the husband snapped. "Some of us are trying to work." The woman's face flushed red. "He's 2 years old. This is how 2-year-olds behave on airplanes." I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned forward. "Excuse me," I said softly to the mother. "Would it help if he could see out the window? Sometimes kids calm down when they can watch the ground crew." She looked back at me gratefully. "Would you mind? I tried, but he can't see over the seat back." I stood carefully in the narrow space, lifting the toddler gently. He was heavier than he looked, all solid muscle and energy. "Hey there, buddy. Want to see the big airplane engines?" I positioned him so he could look out my window, his small hands pressed against the thick plastic. The crying stopped immediately. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the massive jet engine, the spinning baggage carts, and the organized chaos of airport operations. "Plane!" he said, his voice filled with wonder. "That's right, big plane. We're gonna fly really high, up in the clouds." I kept my voice calm and steady, the same tone I'd used to brief nervous student pilots. "See those men in the orange vests? They're making sure our airplane is safe and ready to go." Marcus watched this interaction with barely concealed irritation. "Great, now you're a babysitter too." The woman shot him a look that could have frozen jet fuel. "He's being kind. Maybe you should try it sometime." "I'm just saying, we're not running a daycare here." Marcus returned to his phone, his fingers jabbing at the screen with unnecessary force. I ignored him, focusing on the child who was now giggling and pointing at everything he could see. "What's your name, buddy?" "Tommy," he announced proudly. "Well, Tommy, this is my first time being a passenger on one of these big jets. Usually, I'm the one flying the plane." His eyes got even wider. "You fly planes?" "I do. Different kinds, but yeah." I glanced at his mother, who was mouthing "thank you" over and over. "Tell you what, Tommy, once we get up in the air, I'll show you some of the things pilots look for when we're flying. Sounds good?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, his earlier distress completely forgotten. I handed him back to his mother, who had tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you so much," she whispered. "I was about to have a complete meltdown." "No problem. I have nieces his age. I know the drill." As I settled back into my seat, Marcus shook his head. "Typical. Can't resist playing the hero, even when nobody asked."
I was helping a stressed parent. It's called basic human decency. It's called showing off. "Look at me, I'm a pilot." He affected a mocking tone. "You've been out of the military for 2 years, Jake. Time to stop dining out on old glory." The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. We're currently second in line for takeoff, and we're looking at an on-time departure. The weather in Denver is clear and sunny, temperature 72 degrees. Flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. I closed my eyes and let the familiar cadence of the pilot's announcement wash over me. Captain Rodriguez sounded like he knew his business, confident but not cocky, informative without being overwhelming. The kind of voice that made passengers feel safe without even realizing why. "Must be nice," Marcus said, apparently unwilling to let the conversation die. "Listening to someone else do your old job? Doesn't it make you nostalgic? Remind you of what you gave up?" I didn't give up anything. The words came out harder than I meant them to. I made a choice. Right, the choice to quit when things got difficult. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice to avoid attracting more attention. "Come on, Jake. We both know why you really left the Air Force. It wasn't some noble career change. You cracked under pressure." The engines reached full power, and I felt the familiar push against my seat back as we accelerated down the runway. Through the window, I watched the ground fall away, the airport shrinking to toy-sized proportions. Seattle's skyline came into view, the Space Needle looking small and delicate from this altitude. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You couldn't handle the responsibility anymore, all those lives in your hands, all that pressure to be perfect. So you ran, found yourself a nice, safe job teaching weekend pilots how to do touch-and-goes at suburban airports. I turned to face him fully.
My hands clenched into fists on my armrests. You want to know what happened, Marcus? You really want to know? For the first time since we'd boarded, he looked uncertain. Maybe he heard something in my voice that reminded him of the kid who'd put me in a headlock when we were 12, and he'd broken my model airplane. He started, then stopped. I was flying a training mission over Nevada. Student pilot in the back seat, routine formation flight. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited. Should have been a milk run. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence and several passengers gasped as we bounced slightly. I barely noticed, lost in a memory that still wakes me up some nights. The instructor in the lead aircraft had a medical emergency. Massive heart attack at 30,000 feet. His student panicked, started an uncontrolled descent straight toward a populated area. 15,000 people in the town below. Maybe more. Marcus had gone quiet, his phone forgotten in his lap.
I had about 90 seconds to make a choice. Follow protocol and let the tower handle it, or break formation and try to save both pilots and everyone on the ground. I looked out the window, watching clouds drift by like cotton balls. I chose to act. But I broke regulations doing it and got court-martialed. So I resigned my commission and walked away. What happened? I got to the other aircraft, talked the student through regaining control, and helped him land safely. The instructor lived, spent 6 weeks in the hospital, but made a full recovery. I turned back to Marcus, meeting his eyes for the first time since takeoff. Marcus stared at me, his usual smugness replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Surprise? Respect? Or maybe just the dawning realization that he'd been kicking a man who'd already been knocked down. Jake, I didn't know. Of course you didn't. You never asked. You just assumed I'd screwed up somehow, because that's what you expect from me. I leaned back in my seat, suddenly exhausted. You want to know the truth? I'd do it again. Every single time. Because sometimes doing the right thing matters more than following the rules. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began moving around the cabin. Tommy's mother caught my eye and smiled, her child now contentedly coloring in a book. The husband was back to his laptop, having missed the entire emotional exchange happening behind him. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier edge. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Forget it. I pulled out my own book, a technical manual on aviation safety protocols. Just maybe next time, wait to hear the whole story before you decide what kind of person someone is. The plane settled into its cruising altitude, and I tried to focus on the familiar comfort of flight. Up here, 35,000 feet above the world's complications, everything felt simpler, cleaner. The laws of physics were constant and reliable, unlike the messy unpredictability of human relationships. I was just starting to relax when Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom again, and this time, his professional calm had a subtle edge of urgency that made my pilot instincts snap to attention. Folks, we've got a small situation developing, and I'm going to need everyone to remain calm and follow the crew's instructions exactly. The silence that followed Captain Rodriguez's announcement stretched like a taut wire across the cabin. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same hyper-awareness that used to kick in during combat missions when something was about to go very wrong. Around us, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their casual conversations dying as they processed the captain's words. Small situation, Marcus muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped his armrest. That's pilot speak for, we're all gonna die, isn't it?
I was already listening intently to the subtle changes in engine pitch, feeling for any variation in our flight path. The Boeing 737 was still flying straight and level, but there was something different in the way the aircraft felt, a barely perceptible tremor that spoke to deeper issues. Years of flying had taught me to read an airplane like a book, and right now, this one was telling a story I didn't like. Jake, Marcus's voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by the kind of raw fear that strips away pretense. "What do you think is happening?" Before I could answer, Captain Rodriguez came back on the intercom, his voice still professional, but carrying an undertone that made my pilot instincts scream warnings. "Folks, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our hydraulic systems. We're going to need to make an unscheduled landing in Denver. I want to emphasize that this is purely precautionary, and we have backup systems that are functioning normally." The cabin erupted in nervous murmurs. A woman across the aisle started crying softly. Tommy, the toddler who'd been so fascinated by the view earlier, began to sense his mother's tension and started whimpering again. His father finally put away his laptop, his face pale as he reached for his wife's hand. "That doesn't sound good," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Hydraulic systems, that's important, right?" "It depends." I kept my voice calm, falling back on years of training that emphasized never showing panic, especially when passengers or students were involved. Modern aircraft have multiple redundant systems. If one fails, others can compensate. But even as I said it, I was analyzing the subtle cues that most passengers wouldn't notice. The way the flight attendants were moving more quickly than usual, checking seatbelts with increased urgency. The slight adjustment in our altitude. We were descending, gradually, but unmistakably. Most telling of all was the absence of the normal cabin service routine. No beverage cart, no snack service, no casual conversation among the crew. A flight attendant appeared at the front of our section, her professional smile not quite hiding the tension in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be conducting some additional safety checks. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your tray tables are in their upright and locked positions." As she moved down the aisle, I caught her eye. Something in my expression must have conveyed my aviation background because she paused beside our row. "Excuse me, sir, but are you by any chance in the aviation industry?" Marcus looked at me with surprise, then back at the flight attendant. "He's a pilot, former Air Force." I shot him a warning look, but it was too late. The flight attendant's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine relief. "Thank goodness," she whispered. "Could I speak with you privately for just a moment?" My stomach dropped. Flight attendants didn't seek out off-duty pilots unless the situation was significantly worse than the captain was letting on. I unbuckled my seatbelt and followed her toward the galley, aware of Marcus watching with growing alarm. "What's the real situation?" I asked once we were out of earshot of the passengers. Her name tag read Sarah, and up close I could see she was younger than she'd appeared from a distance. Maybe mid-20s, with the kind of practiced composure that comes from extensive training, but not necessarily extensive emergency experience. "She'd lost primary and secondary hydraulics," she said quietly. "Captain Rodriguez is trying to reach Denver, but..." She paused, struggling with how much to reveal. "The landing gear might not deploy normally, and we're having some issues with the flight controls." My blood went cold. Loss of hydraulics in a 737 was serious enough anyway, but combined with compromised flight controls, it became a nightmare scenario. I'd studied cases like this at the Air Force Academy, United 232 in Sioux City, where they'd lost all hydraulics and nearly 200 people died, despite heroic efforts by the crew.
"What about manual reversion?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Limited. The captain says the aircraft is getting harder to control, especially at lower altitudes." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "He asked me to identify any passengers with aviation experience, just in case. Just in case he needed help saving 200 lives." I looked back toward my seat, where Marcus was craning his neck to watch our conversation, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Around him, other passengers were starting to pick up on the subtle signs of a serious emergency. The nervous laughter was getting more forced, the conversations more desperate. Tommy was crying again, and his mother was holding him so tightly that he was squirming in protest. "How long until Denver?" I asked.
About 40 minutes at our current speed and altitude. Sarah checked her watch with the mechanical precision of someone trying to stay calm through routine. The captain wants to dump fuel and configure for an emergency landing. 40 minutes. In a damaged aircraft with questionable controls, carrying 200 souls who were counting on someone to get them home safely. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. I need to get back to my seat, I said. But Sarah, if the captain needs me, I'm in 14A. Whatever's happening up there, you're doing great. Keep the passengers calm, follow your training, and remember that emergency landings, even difficult ones, have a very high survival rate. She nodded, some of the tension leaving her face. Thank you. It helps to know we have someone aboard who understands what's happening. As I walked back to my row, I could feel the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior becoming more pronounced. We were definitely losing altitude more rapidly now, and there was a slight yaw to the left that suggested the pilots were struggling to maintain coordinated flight. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and his first officer were probably working through emergency checklists, trying every trick in the book to coax normal performance from an increasingly uncooperative machine. "What did she want?" Marcus demanded as soon as I sat down. His usual confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of raw vulnerability that emerges when someone realizes they have absolutely no control over their fate. "I just confirmed I had aviation experience," I said, trying to project calm I didn't feel. "They like to know if there are pilots aboard during any kind of irregular situation." "Irregular situation?" Marcus's voice rose slightly. "Jake, what's really happening? And don't give me any of that routine precaution bullshit. I can see it in your face." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw past his expensive suit and arrogant facade to the scared kid who used to wake me up during thunderstorms when we were children. Despite all his condescension, despite his casual cruelty and assumptions about my failures, he was still my brother, and right now, he needed something from me that his law degree and seven-figure salary couldn't provide.
"We're having hydraulic problems," I said quietly. "It's serious, but it's not necessarily catastrophic. The pilots are highly trained for these situations, and Denver has excellent emergency response capabilities. But you're worried." "I'm always worried when I'm not the one flying the plane." I managed what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Occupational hazard of being a pilot. We're terrible passengers because we want to be in control." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing not just my words, but everything that had passed between us since we'd boarded. The mockery, the assumptions, the casual dismissal of my choices and sacrifices. "Jake," he said finally, his voice small. "I'm sorry. About earlier, about everything, I was being an ass." "Yeah, you were." I kept my tone light, but I meant it. "But you're still my brother." Around us, the mood in the cabin was shifting from nervous concern to genuine fear as more passengers picked up on the signs that this wasn't just a routine diversion. Flight attendants were moving through the aisles with increased urgency, checking seatbelts, securing loose items, and quietly identifying passengers who might need special assistance during an emergency landing. Tommy's crying had escalated to full-scale hysteria, and his mother was clearly at the end of her rope. His father was no help, alternately snapping at his wife to do something and burying his face in his hands. I could see other passengers shooting annoyed looks their way, their own fear making them less tolerant of the child's distress. "I should help with that, kid," I said, starting to unbuckle my seatbelt again. Marcus grabbed my arm. "Don't leave, please. I need you here." It was the first time I could remember my older brother admitting he needed me for anything. Growing up, he'd been the golden child. Straight A's, star athlete, scholarship to Harvard Law School. I'd been the screw-up, the dreamer who was always getting into trouble or chasing impractical goals. Even when I'd earned my wings and become a military pilot, he'd found ways to minimize the achievement, to make it seem like luck rather than skill and dedication. But now, 35,000 feet above Colorado with our lives hanging in the balance, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that I was the one person on this airplane who might be able to help if things went really wrong. The intercom crackled to life again, and this time Captain Rodriguez's voice carried a note of barely controlled tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver International Airport. We're going to be conducting what's called a precautionary emergency landing. Emergency vehicles will be standing by as a routine safety measure, but I want to emphasize that we've practiced for this exact scenario many times. I translated that for Marcus. The situation is worse than they initially thought, but they're still confident they can get us down safely. How can you tell? The captain's tone, the fact that he mentioned emergency vehicles, and he gestured toward the windows. Look at our descent rate. We're coming down faster and steeper than normal. As if to emphasize the point, the aircraft banked sharply to the left, the wing dipping at an angle that was definitely outside normal parameters. Several passengers gasped, and someone in the back of the cabin let out a small scream. I felt the familiar sensation of an airplane fighting its pilot's commands, the subtle shudders and oscillations that indicated marginal control. Jesus, Marcus breathed. We're going to crash, aren't we? No. I put every ounce of conviction I could muster into that single word. We're not going to crash. Emergency landings look scary, but they're successful the vast majority of the time. These pilots know what they're doing.
But even as I said it, I was running worst-case scenarios in my head. If they'd lost hydraulics completely, the pilots would be trying to control the aircraft using engine thrust alone, a technique that required incredible skill and more than a little luck. The approach would be faster and steeper than normal, with limited ability to correct for wind or other variables. And if the landing gear wouldn't extend, I pushed that thought away, one crisis at a time. The flight attendants were now conducting what was clearly a briefing for emergency evacuation, though they were trying to do it without creating panic. I could see Sarah demonstrating the brace position to passengers near the front of the cabin, her movements crisp and professional despite the stress she was obviously feeling. "Sir," a voice from behind me made me turn. It was Tommy's mother, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could you help me with him again? He's so scared and nothing I do is working." I looked at the terrified child, then at Marcus, who nodded grimly. "Go," he said. "I'll be okay." I moved to the row in front of us where Tommy was red-faced and sobbing, his small body rigid with fear. His mother looked exhausted, and his father was actively making things worse by demanding quiet with increasing volume and frustration. "Hey, Tommy," I said, settling into the empty seat beside them. "Remember me? I'm the pilot who is showing you the airplane engines." The crying subsided to hiccups as Tommy recognized me. His mother shot me a look of desperate gratitude. "I know you're scared, buddy. Want to know a secret? I'm a little scared too. But you know what? The pilots flying our airplane are really, really good at their job. And even when airplanes have problems, they almost always land safely." "Are we going to crash?" Tommy asked, his voice small and shaky. "No, we're not going to crash, but we are going to have a bumpy landing. It might feel like a roller coaster for a few minutes. Has your mom ever taken you on a roller coaster?" Tommy shook his head, but I could see curiosity beginning to replace terror in his eyes. "Well, this will be your first one. And the best part is when it's over, we'll all be safe on the ground, and there will be fire trucks and ambulances waiting to make sure everyone's okay. Fire trucks are pretty cool, right?" "Fire trucks are awesome," Tommy agreed, his crying finally stopping. "That's right. So here's what we're going to do. When the airplane starts bouncing around, you're going to hold your mom's hand really tight and pretend you're on the coolest roller coaster ever built. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded solemnly, and his mother mouthed, "Thank you," over his head. As I returned to my seat, I realized that talking to Tommy had helped calm my own nerves. There's something about focusing on someone else's fear that puts your own in perspective. Marcus was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like admiration. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "Good at what?" "Taking charge, staying calm when everything's falling apart." He paused. "I'm starting to understand why the Air Force was so upset when you left."
Before I could respond, the aircraft lurched violently to the right, then overcorrected to the left. The movements were sharp and erratic, nothing like the smooth, controlled flight we'd experienced earlier. Around us, passengers were gripping their armrests with white knuckles, and I could hear whispered prayers in multiple languages. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The whine of an aircraft in uncontrolled descent is a sound that haunts every pilot's nightmares. It's the acoustic signature of physics overcoming human intention, of a machine surrendering to gravity despite every effort to maintain control. I'd heard it once before, during a training exercise that had gone terribly wrong, and the memory of that sound could still wake me from a dead sleep. Now I was hearing it again, 35,000 feet above Colorado, trapped in a passenger seat while 200 lives hung in the balance. The Boeing 737 was descending far too rapidly, its nose pointed down at an angle that sent coffee cups and magazines sliding toward the front of the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling compartments with a collective thud that triggered screams throughout the passenger compartment. The automated voice began its mechanical recitation. Oxygen masks have dropped from the compartment above your seat. But I wasn't listening to the recording. I was listening to the engines, feeling the airframe's vibrations through the soles of my feet, reading the airplane's distress like a doctor interpreting symptoms. The pilots were fighting for control, alternating between maximum thrust and idle power as they tried to use engine differential to steer the aircraft. It was a technique of last resort, the kind of flying that required nerves of steel and more luck than anyone had a right to expect. "Put on your mask," I shouted to Marcus, who was staring at the dangling oxygen supply with the blank expression of someone whose mind had simply shut down. I reached across him, pulling the plastic cup over his face and adjusting the elastic strap. "Breathe normally. Don't try to talk." My own mask secured, I looked around the cabin at a scene of barely controlled chaos. Flight attendants were moving through the aisles with professional efficiency, helping passengers with their oxygen masks while maintaining the kind of calm authority that only comes from extensive training. But I could see the fear in their eyes, the recognition that this situation had moved well beyond the scope of normal emergency procedures. Tommy was crying again, his small face nearly invisible behind the adult-sized oxygen mask his mother was holding over his nose and mouth. His father had gone completely pale, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage his own equipment. Across the aisle, an elderly couple were holding hands and praying quietly, their faces serene with the kind of acceptance that comes with a lifetime of facing life's uncertainties. The aircraft lurched again, this time rolling sharply to the right before snapping back to wings level with the violence that sent several passengers sliding across their seats. Someone was screaming continuously now, a high, keening wail that cut through even the roar of the engines. I could hear what sounded like someone being sick, and the acrid smell of fear sweat was beginning to permeate the cabin despite the oxygen masks. Through my window, I could see we were dropping through a layer of clouds at a rate that made my stomach clench. The ground was becoming visible in patches, still distant, but approaching with inexorable certainty. At this rate of descent, we had maybe 10 minutes before the pilots would have to attempt whatever kind of landing they could manage with their compromised aircraft. That's when I heard Captain Rodriguez's voice over the intercom again, and this time there was no attempt to hide the gravity of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing significant control difficulties and will be making an emergency landing at Denver International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for crash landing procedures." The word crash sent a wave of panic through the passenger compartment like an electric shock. The screaming intensified, and I could see people frantically trying to reach their cell phones, desperate to make what they thought might be final calls to loved ones. The cabin filled with a chaos of voices, some praying, some crying, some shouting instructions or encouragement to family members. But what struck me most was the sudden, desperate quiet from Marcus. When I looked at him, he had removed his oxygen mask and was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of profound sadness mixed with regret. "Jake," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise and passenger commotion, "I need to tell you something." "Save it for the ground," I replied, reaching for his mask. "Keep this on." He pushed my hand away. "No, listen to me. I've been a terrible brother. My whole life, I've been jealous of you, and I've taken it out on you every chance I got. Marcus, Let me finish. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. You were always the brave one, always willing to take risks, to stand up for what you believed in. I became a lawyer because it was safe, because I knew I could win at it. But you became a pilot because you wanted to serve something bigger than yourself. The aircraft shuddered violently, and the descent rate seemed to increase even more. Through the speakers, I could hear flight attendants shouting instructions. Heads down, stay down, brace for impact. When I heard about your court-martial, Marcus continued, ignoring the chaos around us, I thought it proved I was right about you, that you were reckless, that you didn't think things through. But I was wrong. You saved those people, because that's who you are. You put yourself at risk to save others, and instead of celebrating that, I used it to make myself feel superior. Marcus, please put your mask back on. I'm proud of you, he said simply. I should have said it years ago, but I'm proud to be your brother. And if we don't make it through this, I want you to know that. Before I could respond, Sarah appeared beside our row, moving with the kind of purposeful urgency that indicated we were running out of time. Sir, she said, addressing me directly, the captain needs to speak with you. Now. I looked at Marcus, who nodded and reached for his oxygen mask. Go. Do what you do best. I followed Sarah toward the front of the aircraft, moving carefully as the floor pitched and rolled beneath our feet. The passenger compartment looked like a war zone, oxygen masks dangling everywhere, personal belongings scattered across the aisle, people hunched in crash positions or clutching each other in terror. But what struck me most was the sudden, desperate quiet from Marcus. When I looked at him, he had removed his oxygen mask and was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of profound sadness mixed with regret.
The cockpit door was already open when we reached it, revealing a scene of intense, focused activity. Captain Rodriguez was fighting the controls with both hands, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature. His first officer, a young woman with short, dark hair, was working through what looked like an emergency checklist while simultaneously communicating with Denver Approach Control. "Captain," Sarah announced, "this is Jake Sullivan, the pilot I mentioned." Rodriguez turned his head briefly, and I saw exhaustion and strain etched into every line of his face. "Thank God. What's your background?" 8 years Air Force, F-16s, then instructor pilot. I've got about 4,000 hours in fighters, plus civilian instruction time. Ever fly a 737? Sim time only, but I'm familiar with the systems. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Then you know what we're dealing with. Complete hydraulic failure, partial electrical, and we're losing control authority by the minute. I can barely keep the nose up, and we're coming down whether we want to or not. I looked over his shoulder at the instrument panel, reading the story told by warning lights and digital displays. It was worse than I had imagined. Red warning indicators covered the panel like Christmas lights, indicating failures in multiple systems. The altitude indicator showed we were passing through 22,000 feet and descending at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, far too fast for a controlled approach. "What about manual reversion?" I asked, though I could already see from the controls position that they had limited effectiveness. "Minimal. I've got maybe 30% authority on the elevators, less on the ailerons. Rudders completely gone." Rodriguez's voice was tight with concentration as he fought to keep the aircraft's nose from dropping further. "I'm using differential thrust to steer, but at these low speeds, it's not very effective." The first officer, her name tag read Chen, looked up from her checklist. "Denver's cleared us for emergency landing on runway 34R. Fire and rescue are standing by, but they want to know our passenger count and fuel status." 206 souls on board, Rodriguez replied. "Fuel? Christ, we never had a chance to dump. We're carrying about 8,000 pounds. I felt my stomach drop. Landing with that much fuel meant a much higher risk of fire on impact, especially if the gear wasn't functioning properly. What's the status on gear extension?" "Unknown. We'll find out when we get closer to the ground." Rodriguez glanced at me again. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We're probably going to have to put this airplane down hard and fast. I can't guarantee the gear will extend, I can't guarantee we'll stay on the runway, and I sure as hell can't guarantee everyone's gonna walk away. What do you need from me? He paused, wrestling with the controls as the aircraft tried to roll to the right. I need you to go back to the cabin and help the crew prepare for impact. They need someone who understands what's about to happen, someone who can keep people calm and focused. And if something happens to Chen or me, I need to know there's someone aboard who might be able to help land this thing. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I'd been in life-or-death situations before, but never with so many innocent lives at stake. In the military, everyone aboard was a trained professional who understood the risks. Here, I was looking at families, children, elderly passengers who had boarded expecting nothing more dangerous than a routine flight to Denver. "I'll do whatever you need," I said. "Good. Now get back there and help them prepare. We're about 12 minutes from impact." 12 minutes. I made my way back through the cabin, noting details with the hyper-awareness that comes with extreme stress. A businessman was crying quietly while typing what looked like a text message to his family. An elderly woman was comforting a young mother whose baby had been crying since the oxygen masks deployed. Tommy and his family were huddled together, the little boy clinging to his mother with the desperate intensity of someone who sensed mortal danger, even if he couldn't understand it. Marcus looked up as I approached our row. He'd put his oxygen mask back on, but I could see questions in his eyes. "How bad?" he asked when I leaned close. "Bad, but not hopeless." I kept my voice low, not wanting to increase the panic level in the surrounding seats. "The pilots are good, and Denver has excellent emergency response. Whatever happens, stay calm and follow instructions exactly. What about you? Are you going back up there?" "I'm going to help the crew get everyone ready for landing." I paused, looking at my brother, really seeing him, maybe for the first time in years. "Marcus, no matter what happens, I want you to know that I forgive you. For all of it. We're family, and that's what matters." He reached out and gripped my hand, his touch surprisingly strong. "I love you, little brother. I love you too." I moved forward again, finding Sarah near the front of the cabin, where she was demonstrating the brace position to a group of nervous passengers. "What's the situation?" she asked quietly. 12 minutes to emergency landing. Gear status unknown, limited control authority, and we're carrying too much fuel. We need to get everyone prepared for a hard impact and possible evacuation." Sarah nodded, her training taking over despite the fear I could see in her eyes. "What do you need me to do?" "Get everyone in brace position, make sure people understand they need to stay down until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Remove high heels, secure loose objects, and identify anyone who might need special assistance during evacuation. What about children? We have several unaccompanied minors aboard." I looked around the cabin, spotting at least 3 kids who appeared to be traveling alone. They were all terrified, looking around desperately for adults who weren't there. Assign each one to a nearby adult passenger. Make sure they understand they're responsible for getting that child to safety if we need to evacuate. I thought for a moment. Also, identify the strongest, most capable-looking passengers near the emergency exits. If the crew is injured or incapacitated, we'll need civilians who can operate the doors. As Sarah began implementing these instructions, I moved through the cabin myself, stopping to talk to passengers who seemed particularly panicked or confused. It was a delicate balance, providing enough information to ensure cooperation without increasing terror. "Sir," I said to a middle-aged man who was hyperventilating, "I need you to slow your breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. The pilots are very experienced with emergency landings, and the aircraft is designed to protect you even in a hard impact." 3 rows back, I found an off-duty nurse trying to calm an elderly passenger who was having what looked like a panic attack. "How can I help?" "He's having chest pains. Could be anxiety, could be cardiac." She's checking his pulse while trying to keep him calm. "I don't have any medical equipment." "There should be an AED and first aid kit in the forward galley. I'll get it." As I retrieved the medical equipment, I could feel the aircraft's behavior becoming increasingly erratic.
We were now low enough that I could make out individual buildings and roads through the windows, the ground rushing up with terrifying speed. The engines were cycling between high and low power as the pilots fought to maintain some semblance of control. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to a kind of grim determination. People were helping each other with seatbelts and brace position. Strangers were holding hands, sharing quiet words of comfort. I watched a teenager give up his exit row seat to an athletic-looking adult, understanding instinctively that the man would be more useful in an emergency. Tommy's family had moved to the center seats at Sarah's direction, away from the window that might shatter on impact. The little boy was no longer crying, instead listening intently as his mother explained that they were going to play a game where they had to stay very still and keep their heads down. "Is the pilot right?" a voice behind me asked. I turned to see an elderly man, probably in his 70s, looking at me with remarkable calm. "Are we going to crash?" I considered lying, giving him false reassurance, but something in his eyes told me he deserved the truth.
"We're going to make an emergency landing," I said. "It's going to be rough, and there are no guarantees, but the pilots are doing everything possible to get us down safely, and this aircraft is built to protect its passengers even in extreme situations." He nodded slowly. "I was in Korea, seen my share of close calls." He gestured toward a woman about his age who was sleeping, or unconscious, in the seat beside him. "That's my wife of 52 years. She took a sleeping pill when we hit turbulence. Part of me's glad she's not awake for this." "What's your name?" "Frank. Frank Morrison." "Frank, when we touch down, there's going to be a lot of noise and chaos. I need you to protect your wife and be ready to help her evacuate quickly if necessary. Can you do that?" "Son, I carried her out of a burning house in 1987 and out of floodwaters in 2005. I'm not stopping now." The intercom crackled to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're beginning our final approach to Denver International Airport. Please assume crash positions now and remain in that position until the aircraft has come to a complete stop. Crew, prepare for emergency landing." Through the windows, I could see the airport approaching, runways laid out like concrete strips, emergency vehicles positioned along the approach path with their lights flashing. The ground was coming up fast, too fast, and I could feel the aircraft struggling against the pilot's commands like a wild animal fighting its reins. "Heads down! Stay down!" Sarah was shouting, moving through the cabin one final time to ensure everyone was properly positioned. I made my way back to my seat, where Marcus was already in the correct brace position. As I buckled myself in and assumed the crash position myself, I felt the aircraft's landing gear extending, or at least some of it. There was a mechanical grinding sound followed by what felt like partial deployment. "Jake," Marcus said, his voice muffled by his position but still audible. "Whatever happens, thank you for being my brother." Through the small gap between my arms, I could see the runway rushing up to meet us. We were coming in steep and fast, the approach angle all wrong for a normal landing. I could hear the engines spooling up and down as the pilots made their final attempts to control our descent. The last thing I saw before impact was the ground filling the entire window, concrete and grass, and emergency vehicles racing toward us at impossible speed. Then the world exploded into noise and chaos and the grinding shriek of metal against concrete as Flight 1247 hit the runway at Denver International Airport at nearly twice normal landing speed, with questionable landing gear and no hydraulic controls. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then slammed down with a force that felt like being hit by a giant hammer. We were sliding sideways, sparks flying past the windows as metal scraped against concrete. The sound was indescribable, a combination of tearing metal, screaming engines, and the terrified cries of 200 people who suddenly found themselves in a fight for their lives. I felt the aircraft beginning to break apart around us, the fuselage flexing and cracking under stresses it was never designed to handle. Overhead bins burst open, raining luggage and debris down on the passengers. The lights went out, leaving us in a twilight world of emergency lighting and the acrid smell of burning metal. But we were down, broken, battered, and sliding out of control across a Denver runway, but we were down. Now came the real test, getting everyone out alive. The silence that followed the crash landing was more terrifying than the impact itself.
For a moment that stretched like eternity, the only sounds were the settling groans of tortured metal and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. Then, gradually, the human sounds began. Coughs, whimpers, confused voices asking if everyone was okay.
I lifted my head slowly, every muscle in my body screaming from the violence of our landing. The cabin was a disaster zone, filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow, and I could see gaping holes in the fuselage where the aircraft had torn apart during our slide across the runway. But we were alive. Somehow, impossibly, we were alive. "Marcus?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "You okay?" "I think so." His reply came from somewhere to my right, though the darkness made it hard to see him clearly. "Jesus, Jake, we actually made it." Around us, passengers were beginning to stir, checking themselves and their loved ones for injuries. I could hear children crying, adults calling out names, and the professional voices of flight attendants beginning to take charge of the evacuation process. But something was wrong. The voices sounded confused, disorganized. Where was the clear, authoritative direction that should have been coming from the crew? I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood carefully, immediately feeling the aircraft's unstable position. We were tilted at an odd angle, the nose lower than the tail, and I could feel the entire structure settling as components that were never meant to bear weight adjusted to new stresses. Through the nearest window, I could see we were hundreds of yards from where we should have been, having slid far off the runway into what looked like rough ground. "Sarah?" I called out toward the front of the cabin. "Sarah, are you okay?" No response. That couldn't be good. Moving forward was like navigating an obstacle course. Luggage had burst from overhead bins, creating a debris field that blocked the aisle in several places. Oxygen masks dangled everywhere, like strange, life-giving Spanish moss. Several passenger seats had been torn loose from their mountings, creating additional hazards. I found Sarah near the forward galley, conscious but clearly injured. She was holding her left arm against her body, and there was blood on her forehead from what looked like a head wound. "Sarah, talk to me. How bad are you hurt?" "Shoulders dislocated, I think, maybe broken." Her voice was tight with pain, but professionally controlled. "I can function, but I can't operate the emergency doors properly." "What about the other flight attendants?" "Jim's unconscious in the back, head injury. Carol's okay, but she's trapped under some debris." Sarah tried to stand, then sank back down with a grimace. "Jake, we need to get these people out. The fuel smell is getting stronger, and I can see sparks from the engine area." Fire. The word she didn't say hung in the air between us like a death sentence. With 8,000 pounds of jet fuel on board and electrical systems shorting out, we were sitting in a potential bomb. Every second we delayed evacuation increased the risk that this rescue would become a body recovery operation. "Okay, I'm taking charge of the evacuation." The words came out with more authority than I felt, but Sarah nodded gratefully. "Which exits are functional?" she said, continuing to assess the damage. "I can see the left side forward exit is jammed, the doors twisted in its frame. Right side forward should work, but I can't operate it with the shoulder."
I looked toward the rear of the aircraft, where I could see passengers beginning to panic as they realized the severity of our situation. Someone was screaming about fire, and I could see the orange glow of actual flames beginning to flicker outside the right side windows near the wing. "Attention, passengers!" I shouted, my voice carrying the command authority I'd learned in 8 years of military service. "This is an emergency evacuation. I need everyone to listen carefully and follow instructions exactly." The cabin fell silent, except for the sounds of settling wreckage and distant sirens. Faces turned toward me, some hopeful, some terrified. all looking for someone to tell them what to do. My name is Jake Sullivan. I'm a pilot, and I'm going to get everyone out safely, but I need your help. I started moving toward the functional exit, speaking as I went. If you're able-bodied and near an emergency exit, I need you to assist with door operation. If you're injured or have children, move toward the center of the cabin and wait for assistance. Are we going to die? The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the cabin. A young woman, probably college-aged, her voice high with terror. No, I said firmly. We are not going to die. We survived the hardest part. Now we just need to get out quickly and calmly. I reached the right forward exit and examined the door mechanism. Standard Boeing 737 configuration, same as I'd trained on in the simulator. The handle was clearly marked, and the inflation slide should deploy automatically when opened. But first, I needed to check outside conditions. Looking through the small window, I could see emergency vehicles racing across the field toward us, their lights painting the evening sky in reds and blues. Good. Help was coming. But I could also see that the fuel spill was larger than I had hoped, and the electrical fire near the right engine was definitely growing. Frank, I called out, remembering the Korean War veteran I'd spoken with before landing. Are you and your wife okay? We're here. His voice was strong, determined. She's awake now, confused but mobile. I need you at the left side exit. Can you handle door operation if I talk you through it? Just tell me what to do, son. As I began explaining the exit procedures to Frank and several other passengers, I heard a new voice from the front of the cabin, Captain Rodriguez, apparently conscious and trying to move forward from the cockpit. This is Captain Rodriguez, he announced, his voice weak but carrying. Is everyone okay back there? Captain, I called out. Jake Sullivan here. We're beginning evacuation procedures. What's your status? Both pilots conscious, but Chen's got a serious leg injury. I can barely walk myself. There was a pause, then Rodriguez's voice again, stronger this time. Sullivan, I'm officially placing you in charge of passenger evacuation. You have command authority.
The weight of those words settled on me like a mantle. In the military, I'd been responsible for million-dollar aircraft and the lives of my crew members, but this felt different, heavier. These weren't trained military personnel who understood the risks. These were innocent civilians who'd trusted their lives to a system that had failed them. Understood, Captain. We're going to get everyone out. I returned my attention to the exit door, running through the checklist in my head. Check outside conditions. Fire visible, but not directly adjacent to this exit. Ensure area below is clear of debris. Hard to tell in the emergency lighting, but it looked passable. Confirm slide deployment space. Adequate. Opening right forward exit now, I announced. Everyone stand clear. I pulled the door handle with the sharp, decisive motion I'd practiced countless times in training. The door swung outward, and the evacuation slide began inflating with a loud hiss of compressed air. Emergency lighting illuminated the slide as it deployed, creating a pathway to safety that looked impossibly steep and narrow from inside the aircraft. Okay, listen up, I called out over the noise of the inflating slide. Evacuation order is injured passengers first, then families with children, then everyone else. Remove high-heeled shoes, leave all personal belongings behind. When you go down the slide, cross your arms over your chest, keep your feet together, and move away from the aircraft immediately once you reach the bottom. Tommy's family was among the first to reach the exit. The little boy who'd been so fascinated by the airplane engines earlier was now clinging to his mother, his face pale with shock. His father, who'd been so dismissive of his family's needs during the flight, was now hovering protectively over both of them. "It's okay, Tommy," I said, kneeling down to his level. "Remember what I told you about the fire trucks? They're all waiting for you down there. You're gonna slide down like it's the world's biggest playground slide." Tommy looked at me with the absolute trust that only children can give. "Will you come too?" "I'll be right behind you. But first, I have to make sure everyone else gets out safely. That's what pilots do." His mother was crying as she gathered him in her arms. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." I helped them position correctly at the top of the slide, mother holding child, father ready to follow. Jump together, stay together, move away from the airplane as soon as you land. Go! They disappeared down the slide into the darkness, and I immediately turned to help the next group. The evacuation was proceeding smoothly, but I could see the fire outside growing larger. We needed to move faster. Frank, how's your exit coming? Doors open, slide deployed, getting people out as fast as I can. The elderly nurse I'd met earlier appeared at my elbow, helping an injured passenger toward the exit. This man has a probable concussion, conscious but disoriented. Get him down the slide. You go with him and check him out once you're on the ground. Sir, I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say. Sit down, cross your arms, and push off when I tell you. As the evacuation continued, I found myself falling into a rhythm that felt hauntingly familiar. It was like combat flying, the same hyper-awareness, the same need to process multiple threats simultaneously, the same absolute focus on completing the mission regardless of personal cost. But instead of enemy aircraft, I was fighting time and physics and the very real possibility that this aircraft could become an inferno at any moment.
Jake! Marcus appeared beside me, supporting an elderly woman who was moving slowly but determinedly toward the exit. What can I do to help? For a moment, I saw my brother clearly, not the arrogant lawyer who'd been mocking me hours earlier, but the person he'd always been underneath the professional facade. He was scared, but he was there, ready to help, asking what he could do rather than complaining about the situation. Take charge of the left side exit. Help Frank coordinate the flow of passengers. Make sure people are moving away from the aircraft once they're down. Marcus nodded and disappeared into the crowd of evacuating passengers. I could hear his voice a few moments later, calm and authoritative, as he began directing people with the same natural leadership that had made him successful in his legal career. The cabin was slowly emptying, but I could see several passengers still trapped in the rear section where debris had blocked the aisle. The smell of fuel was getting stronger, and I could hear what sounded like electrical arcing coming from somewhere behind the passenger compartment. "Sarah," I called to the injured flight attendant, "how many people are left?" "Maybe 20 in the back section? But Jake, I can see flames through the rear galley window. We're running out of time." I made a command decision that would have given my old Air Force safety instructors nightmares. I'm going back there. Keep evacuating from this exit. If the fire reaches this section, get yourself out immediately. Don't wait for me. "Jake, no, it's too dangerous." But I was already moving, climbing over debris and squeezed through gaps that were barely wide enough for a person. The rear section of the aircraft was in worse shape than the front. More twisted metal, more blocked passages, and an ominous orange glow visible through several windows. I found about 15 passengers trapped behind a massive piece of overhead bin assembly that had torn loose and wedged across the aisle. They were scared, some injured, but alive and alert. "Okay, everyone, listen," I shouted over the growing noise of the fire. "We're going to move this debris and get you out. I need every able-bodied person to help lift on my count." Among the trapped passengers was a man about my age, wearing a military haircut and moving with the controlled precision that marked him as active duty or recent veteran. "What branch?" I asked quickly. "Army. Staff Sergeant Williams." He was already positioning himself at one end of the debris. "What's the plan, sir?" "We lift together, create enough space for people to crawl under. Injured go first, then everyone else." I looked around at the faces watching me. "This is going to work, but I need everyone to stay calm and move quickly." The lift was successful, barely. The debris shifted just enough to create a crawl space, and we began moving people through one by one. An elderly man with a broken arm, a young mother with a screaming baby, a businessman who kept insisting he needed to get his laptop from the overhead bin, until Sergeant Williams firmly redirected his priorities. I was helping the last passenger through the gap when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinctive whoosh of jet fuel igniting. Through the rear windows,
I could see flames beginning to race along the fuel spill toward the aircraft. "Move! Move! Move!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of calm as we all rushed toward the front of the cabin.
Behind us, I could hear the fire reaching the aircraft itself, the sound of metal expanding and contracting as intense heat began to affect the structure. We had maybe minutes before the rear section became untenable, maybe less before the fuel tanks caught fire and turned the entire aircraft into a massive explosion. We reached the forward section to find most of the passengers had evacuated, but Sarah was still there, helping the last few people down the slide. Her face was pale with pain and exhaustion, but she was still functioning. "That's everyone from the back," I reported. "How many left?" "Just us and a few more. Frank and your brother got everyone else out." She gestured toward the slide. "You need to go, now." "Not without you." I helped her toward the exit, feeling the aircraft structure beginning to shift more noticeably as the fire weakened critical supports. Together. That's when we heard it. A voice from outside, amplified by a megaphone, cutting through the chaos with startling clarity. "This is Denver Emergency Response. Is anyone still aboard the aircraft? We need immediate evacuation. The fuel tanks are critical." I reached the exit and looked down to see a scene that took my breath away. The slide was surrounded by emergency personnel, firefighters, paramedics, airport security. Beyond them, I could see what looked like hundreds of passengers, sitting or standing in organized groups, being checked by medical personnel and comforted by Red Cross volunteers. We'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, we'd gotten everyone out. But the voice on the megaphone wasn't finished. "We're looking for the pilot who coordinated the evacuation. We need him for emergency debriefing. His call sign was Viper. Repeat, we need Pilot Viper to report to the incident commander immediately." The world seemed to stop. Viper. My old Air Force call sign, the name I'd carried through 8 years of military service and countless combat missions. The name that had been stripped from me along with my commission and my career. But somehow, Captain Rodriguez remembered it. Somehow, in the chaos of our emergency landing, he'd managed to communicate my background to the emergency responders. And now they were calling for me. Not Jake Sullivan, the disgraced ex-pilot, but Viper, the combat veteran who just helped save 200 lives. I helped Sarah down the slide, then followed her into the cool Colorado evening. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I was surrounded by emergency personnel, their faces reflecting a mixture of professional urgency and something that looked almost like awe. "Are you Viper?" The voice belonged to a fire chief, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes bright with intelligence and authority. "I'm Jake Sullivan, former Air Force call sign Viper." "Son, you just pulled off one of the most successful emergency evacuations I've ever seen. 206 passengers, 0 fatalities, minimal serious injuries. How the hell did you manage that?" Before I could answer, I heard a familiar voice calling my name. Marcus appeared through the crowd of emergency responders, his expensive suit torn and dirty, but his face alive with an expression I'd never seen before. "Jake, thank God!" He reached me and pulled me into a fierce hug. "I watched you coordinate that whole evacuation. You were incredible!" Around us, I could see other passengers turning at the sound of my name. Tommy broke free from his parents and ran toward me, his small arms wrapping around my legs. "You saved us!" he announced with the absolute certainty of a child. "You saved everyone!" More passengers were gathering now, their faces showing recognition and gratitude. The businessman who'd been worried about his laptop, the elderly couple who'd been praying during our descent, the college student who'd asked if we were going to die, Frank Morrison, still standing protectively beside his wife, but beaming with pride. "That's him," I heard someone say. "That's the pilot who got us out." "He wasn't even in the crew," another voice added. "He was just a passenger like us." The fire chief was still waiting for an answer to his question, but I found myself looking past him toward the burning aircraft that had nearly become our tomb. The flames were reaching toward the fuel tanks now, and I knew it was only a matter of minutes before the explosion that would have killed us all if we'd been even slightly slower. "I didn't do anything special," I said finally.
I just did what anyone with training would have done. No, Marcus said firmly, that's not true. What you did in there wasn't just training, it was who you are. It's who you've always been, even when I was too stupid to see it. Captain Rodriguez appeared through the crowd, supported by 2 paramedics, but insisting on walking under his own power. His face was bruised and his flight uniform was torn, but his eyes were clear and focused. Viper, he said, using my call sign with the respect that one pilot gives another, I owe you a debt I can never repay. When I lost consciousness during the landing, I thought we were all going to die. But you took charge. You saved everyone. Captain, you got us down. That landing was incredible, flying under impossible conditions. The landing was just the beginning, getting everyone out alive. That was all you. Rodriguez extended his hand. It's been an honor flying with you, even under these circumstances. Behind a crowd of passengers and emergency personnel, I could see news crews beginning to arrive. There are cameras and bright lights turning the crash site into a media circus. But for the moment, all of that felt distant and unimportant. What mattered was the faces around me. People who were alive because sometimes when everything goes wrong, someone steps up and does what needs to be done. As if reading my thoughts, the fire chief spoke again. Son, I've been in emergency response for 23 years. I've seen a lot of crashes, a lot of evacuations. What you did tonight wasn't just professional, it was heroic. Every person here owes their life to your actions. The word heroic hit me like a physical blow. For 2 years, I'd carried the weight of my court-martial, the knowledge that my military career had ended in disgrace, despite my best intentions. I'd told myself that it didn't matter, that I'd done the right thing regardless of the consequences. But hearing that word, seeing the faces of the people I'd helped save, I realized that maybe redemption wasn't something that came from external validation. Maybe it came from simply doing the right thing, again and again, regardless of who was watching or what the cost might be. The aircraft behind us finally surrendered to the flames, the fuel tanks exploding in a fireball that lit up the entire airport. The heat washed over us even at this distance, and I could hear several passengers gasp as they realized how close we'd all come to being consumed by that inferno. But we weren't. We were all here, standing on solid ground, breathing cool Colorado air, alive and whole and grateful. Tommy looked up at me with the kind of wonder that only children can manage. Are you really a hero? He asked. I knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that held no judgment, no cynicism, no knowledge of court-martials or career failures or family disappointments. No, buddy, I said softly. I'm just a pilot who did his job. The days following Flight 1247's emergency landing blurred together in a haze of interviews, medical evaluations, and bureaucratic procedures. The National Transportation Safety Board wanted my statement. The FAA required detailed technical debriefings. News outlets from around the world requested interviews with the hero pilot who had saved 200 lives. But through it all, what stayed with me most clearly were the quiet moments. Holding Tommy as he fell asleep during a lengthy interview, watching Marcus explain to our parents over FaceTime that their younger son wasn't a failure after all, reading thank you cards from passengers who called me their guardian angel.
I was sitting in a Denver hotel room 3 days after the crash, reviewing my written statement for the NTSB one final time when there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Captain Rodriguez, looking remarkably well for someone who'd just survived a catastrophic aircraft accident. Mind if I come in? He asked. There's something I need to discuss with you. Rodriguez had been hailed as a hero himself for his masterful handling of an impossible situation. The preliminary investigation had already determined that his decision-making and flying skills had been flawless under circumstances that should have killed everyone aboard. But as he settled into the chair across from me, I could see something in his eyes that looked like unfinished business. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "Physically, I'm fine. Few bruises, nothing that won't heal." He paused, studying my face.
But I've been thinking a lot about what happened in that cabin after we landed, about the choice you made to take charge when my crew was injured. Anyone with training would have done the same thing. Would they? Rodriguez leaned forward. Jake, I've been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years. I've known hundreds of pilots, military and civilian. Most of them are good people, competent professionals. But what you did that night went beyond training or competence. You saw what needed to be done, and you did it, regardless of the personal risk. I wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but something in his tone suggested it was important. I did some research on you, Rodriguez continued. Found out about your Air Force career, your court-martial, the circumstances of your resignation. He held up a hand when I started to speak. I'm not here to judge your past decisions. I'm here because of what those decisions tell me about your character. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder that looked official. United Airlines has been watching the coverage of Flight 1247. More specifically, they've been watching you. Your technical knowledge, your leadership under pressure, your ability to remain calm in a crisis situation. My heart began to race as I realized what he might be suggesting. They want to offer you a position, Rodriguez said simply. Not as a first officer starting at the bottom, but as a captain. Full command authority, fast track to wide-body aircraft, and a signing bonus that reflects the value they place on your experience and demonstrated abilities. I stared at the folder, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. After 2 years of teaching weekend pilots and consulting on safety protocols, the possibility of returning to commercial aviation, especially at the captain level, seemed almost too good to be true. Why? I asked. My military record is hardly spotless. Your military record shows a pilot who was willing to break regulations to save lives. The airline industry needs people who can make difficult decisions under pressure, who understand that sometimes doing the right thing matters more than following procedures. Rodriguez smiled. Plus, after the media coverage of your actions on Flight 1247, you've become something of a folk hero. United would be proud to have you representing their company. I opened the folder and scanned the contract terms. The salary was more than I'd ever made as an Air Force captain. The signing bonus alone was enough to pay off my student loans and put a substantial down payment on a house. But more than the money, what caught my attention was the aircraft assignment. Boeing 770 international routes, the kind of flying I'd dreamed about since I was a kid watching airliners cross the sky above my childhood home.
When would I start? As soon as you're ready. They understand you might need some time to process everything that's happened. I closed the folder and looked out the hotel window at the Denver skyline. Somewhere out there, investigators were still examining the wreckage of Flight 1247, trying to understand exactly how a routine flight had turned into a near disaster. Somewhere else, 200 people were returning to their normal lives, most of them probably already beginning to forget the details of their brush with mortality. But I would never forget. The weight of those lives in my hands, the trust in their eyes as they looked to me for leadership, the absolute conviction that I would rather die than let them down. Those memories would stay with me forever. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "When you radioed my call sign to the emergency responders, how did you know?" Rodriguez chuckled. "I served 4 years in the Navy before I became a commercial pilot. I recognized the way you moved, the way you communicated, the way you took charge without hesitation. Military bearing is hard to fake and impossible to hide when the pressure's on." "But you called me Viper, specifically." "I looked up your service record while we were stuck in Denver for debriefings. I figured if we were going to work together in the future, I should know who I was dealing with." His expression grew serious. "What I found was a pilot with an exemplary record who made one difficult decision that cost him his military career. That tells me you're exactly the kind of person I want in a cockpit." There was another knock at the door. I opened it to find Marcus, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that was equal parts excitement and nervousness. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, nodding to Rodriguez. "But, Jake, I just got off the phone with Mom and Dad. They want to fly out here tomorrow to see you." Rodriguez stood to leave. "I'll let you think about the offer," he said, handing me his business card. "But don't think too long. United wants to get you started as soon as possible." After he left, Marcus settled into the chair and handed me one of the coffee cups. My brother looked different than he had on the airplane. More relaxed, more genuine, as if the crash had stripped away some layer of pretense he'd been carrying for years. "United Airlines?" he asked. I couldn't help but overhear. "Captain position, international routes." I took a sip of coffee, still trying to process the magnitude of the opportunity. But nothing. It's a great offer. Marcus studied my face with the analytical skills that had made him successful in legal negotiations. "There's something you're not saying." I was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts that I'd barely admitted to myself. For the last 2 years, I've been telling myself that I was happy with my new life, teaching flying, consulting work, staying out of the spotlight. But the truth is, I've been hiding. From what? From the possibility of having that kind of responsibility again. 200 lives depending on my decisions, my skills, my judgment. I set down the coffee cup and looked at my hands. What if I'm not ready? What if I freeze up when someone's life is on the line? Marcus laughed, a sound so unexpected that I looked up in surprise. "Are you serious right now? Jake, 3 days ago, I watched you take control of a disaster that should have killed everyone involved. You didn't freeze up. You were the calmest person in that entire aircraft. You saved every single person aboard, including me." That was different. I was reacting to an emergency, not making calculated decisions about bullshit. Marcus's voice carried the same firmness he used in courtrooms. "You think that was just reaction? You coordinated a complex evacuation under life-threatening conditions. You made dozens of critical decisions in real time, any one of which could have cost lives if you'd gotten it wrong. And you got them all right." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "You want to know what I saw in that cabin? I saw my little brother doing exactly what he was born to do, leading, protecting, making the hard choices that other people can't or won't make." "Marcus, I'm not finished." He held up a hand. "I spent most of our lives thinking you were reckless, that you made impulsive decisions without considering the consequences. But I was wrong. You don't make impulsive decisions, you make moral ones. You see what needs to be done, and you do it, regardless of the personal cost." I thought about his words, about the pattern he was describing. The court-martial that had ended my military career had come from exactly that kind of decision, choosing to save lives over following regulations. And on Flight 1247, I'd done the same thing again, taking responsibility for the evacuation even though it wasn't my job. "The Air Force couldn't see past their rules to recognize that kind of character," Marcus continued. "But United can. They're not just offering you a job, Jake. They're offering you a chance to do what you were meant to do." That evening, I walked alone through downtown Denver, processing everything that had happened and everything that might happen next. The city was beautiful in the fading light, the mountains visible in the distance like a promise of adventure and possibility. Street vendors were selling newspapers with headlines about Flight 1247, most of them featuring photos of the passengers evacuating down the emergency slides. I stopped at a newsstand and bought a copy of the Denver Post. The main headline read, "Hero Pilot Saves 200 Lives," with a subheadline that mentioned my Air Force background and the circumstances of my resignation. But what caught my attention was a smaller story on the inside pages. Passengers credit off-duty pilot with saving their lives. The article included quotes from people I'd helped evacuate. Tommy's mother talking about how I'd calmed her son during the crisis. Frank Morrison describing my leadership during the evacuation. A college student who said I'd given her hope when she thought she was going to die. Marcus, identified as my brother, saying that he'd watched me transform from passenger to leader in a matter of minutes. But the quote that affected me most came from Captain Rodriguez. "In 30 years of aviation, I've never seen anyone handle an emergency with the skill and composure that Jake Sullivan demonstrated. He's the kind of pilot that passengers can trust with their lives, and that's the highest compliment I can give to anyone in this profession." My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize.
When I opened it, I found a photo of Tommy with his parents at what looked like their home, the little boy grinning and holding a toy airplane. The message read, "From Tommy's mom. He wants to be a pilot when he grows up, just like Captain Jake. Thank you for saving our family." I stood on that Denver street corner, surrounded by the evening rush of a city returning to normal life, and felt something shift inside me. For 2 years, I'd been carrying the weight of my military failure, letting it define who I was and what I thought I deserved. But maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the pattern of my life wasn't of reckless decisions and career failure, but of moral courage and the willingness to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. My phone rang. When I answered, I heard Captain Rodriguez's voice. "Have you made a decision about United's offer?"
I looked up at the evening sky, where the navigation lights of commercial aircraft were beginning to appear as the sun set behind the mountains. Each one of those lights represented hundreds of people trusting their lives to pilots they'd never met, believing that someone in the cockpit had the skill and judgment to get them safely to their destination. "Yes," I said, "I accept." "Outstanding. When can you start training?" "As soon as possible." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. United's training program was intensive and comprehensive, covering everything from advanced weather systems to crew resource management to emergency procedures. But what struck me most was the culture of the airline, the emphasis on safety, the respect for pilots who made difficult decisions, the understanding that sometimes the right choice isn't the one prescribed in the manual. My fellow trainees were a diverse group: former military pilots transitioning to civilian aviation, regional airline captains moving up to major carriers, and a few experienced first officers finally getting their chance at command. They all knew my story, the court-martial, the circumstances of Flight 1247, the media attention that had followed. But instead of judgment, I found acceptance and even admiration. "You're lucky," said Maria Santos, a former Navy pilot who was transitioning from FA-18s to Boeing 777s. "Most of us will go our entire careers without ever facing the kind of situation you handled on Flight 1247. You've already proven you can lead under the worst possible circumstances." The simulator training was challenging but exhilarating. The Boeing 777 was a magnificent aircraft, larger and more complex than anything I'd flown before, but with the kind of advanced systems that made it a joy to operate. During my check rides, I found myself thinking about the passengers who would someday trust their lives to my decisions, and the responsibility felt not burdensome, but inspiring. Marcus flew out to Denver for my graduation from the training program. Our parents came too, along with several other family members who wanted to witness this moment. As I walked across the stage to receive my captain's wings, I could see the pride in their faces. But more importantly, I could feel the pride in myself. After the ceremony, we gathered at a restaurant near the airport to celebrate. Marcus raised his glass for a toast, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had marked our relationship for so many years. "To my brother Jake," he said, "who taught me that heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about doing the right thing when no one is watching, and doing it again when everyone is. To Captain Sullivan, may you have fair winds and following seas." 2 months later, I was walking through Dulles International Airport toward the gate for my first flight as a United Airlines captain. Flight 2847 to Frankfurt, with 347 passengers and a crew of 14. It was a routine international flight, the kind of assignment that would have been unimaginable to me just 6 months earlier. As I conducted my pre-flight inspection of the Boeing 777, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The court-martial that had seemed like the end of my career had actually been the beginning of a different kind of service. The shame I'd carried for 2 years had transformed into a deeper understanding of what it meant to be responsible for other people's lives.
My fellow trainees were a young woman named Katie Chen, no relation to the co-pilot from Flight 1247, but equally professional and competent. As we worked through our pre-flight checklist, she asked me about my background. "She heard you were the pilot from that emergency in Denver. That must have been intense." "It was," I replied, "but it taught me something important about this job. We're not just operating aircraft, we're protecting the people who trust us to get them home safely." "Is that why you came to United?"
I thought about the question as I checked the weather radar display. United offered me a chance to do what I love while serving something bigger than myself. That's all any pilot can ask for. The boarding process went smoothly, and as I watched passengers filing onto the aircraft, I found myself thinking about their stories. The businessman traveling to a conference in Germany, the young couple on their honeymoon, the elderly woman visiting grandchildren she hadn't seen in 2 years. Each of them had chosen to trust their life to our crew, and that trust was something I would never take lightly. As we pushed back from the gate and began our taxi to the runway, I keyed the intercom to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan speaking. Welcome aboard United Flight 2847 to Frankfurt. We're looking at a smooth flight tonight, with arrival approximately 30 minutes ahead of schedule. The weather in Frankfurt is clear and cool, perfect for arrival. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for choosing United Airlines." As we lifted off into the clear Virginia sky, climbing toward our cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, I felt a sense of completeness that I hadn't experienced since my early days as an Air Force pilot. This was what I was meant to do. Not just fly aircraft, but protect and serve the people who depended on aviation to connect them with the world. My radio crackled with a call from departure control. "United 2847, contact Washington Center on 124.15. Have a good flight, Captain." "Contact Washington Center 124.15. Thank you for the service today." As we flew through the night toward Europe, I thought about the passengers sleeping peacefully in the cabin behind me, trusting that their crew would deliver them safely to their destination. I thought about Tommy, who had sent me a drawing of an airplane with Captain Jake written in crayon across the wing. I thought about Marcus, who now introduced me as his brother, the airline pilot, with obvious pride. I thought about Captain Rodriguez, who had given me a second chance at the career I'd always wanted. But mostly, I thought about the future, about the thousands of flights ahead of me, the millions of passengers who would trust their lives to my judgment, the opportunity to serve others while doing the work I loved most in the world. The court-martial that had ended my military career had taught me that sometimes doing the right thing comes with a cost. But Flight 1247 had taught me something even more important, that the right thing is always worth doing, regardless of the consequences. As we crossed into international airspace, heading toward Frankfurt and a new chapter in my life, I keyed the radio one more time. "Washington Center, United 2847 is with you, level at flight level 390. United 2847, radar contact. Good evening, Captain." Good evening indeed. And even better, there would be many more evenings like this one. Opportunities to serve, to lead, to protect the people who trusted their lives to the skills and judgment of their flight crew. I was exactly where I belonged. It's been 5 years since the dramatic events of Flight 1247, the night when a routine trip turned into an emergency landing at Denver International Airport that changed lives forever. Now, on a crisp October morning, Captain Jake Sullivan, no longer a passenger but a respected pilot, is preparing for United Airlines Flight 1847 from Denver to London Heathrow. The anniversary of the crash is today, and though Jake has flown this route countless times since then, this particular flight carries deep personal and symbolic meaning.
In the crew briefing room, Jake and his first officer, Captain Sarah Chen, go over the flight plan. Sarah, recently promoted, represents a new generation of aviators, inspired in part by the legacy of Flight 1247. The bond between Jake and Sarah is professional but warm, reflecting mutual respect. Sarah asks if Jake was truly a passenger on the infamous flight, a question prompted by the award-winning documentary made about that night. Jake confirms he was indeed aboard, though not as crew.
The documentary, which had initially made him uncomfortable, became a powerful tribute to human resilience. He participated at the urging of his brother Marcus, believing it might help others who faced their own life-altering challenges. Just then, Jake receives a text from Tommy Morrison's mother. Tommy, now 8 years old, is pictured standing proudly beside a small Cessna wearing a child's pilot uniform. The message says it's his first flying lesson and he wants to be just like Captain Jake. Tommy had been a child on Flight 1247, and Jake has stayed in contact with his family ever since. Tommy's grandfather, Frank Morrison, sadly passed 2 years earlier, but the family remains a source of encouragement and gratitude. Other passengers' lives were changed too. A scared college student from that flight, for instance, is now a social worker, helping others navigate trauma just as she had. The flight to London is not just a normal route. It's part tribute, part reunion, and part living symbol of resilience. As Jake and Sarah walk to the aircraft, they pass by a memorial plaque near Gate 37. In honor of the crew and passengers of Flight 1247, October 15th, when ordinary people do extraordinary things. Beneath this dedication are 206 stars, one for each life saved that night. Their aircraft is a gleaming Boeing 777-300ER, a long-haul titan of modern aviation. Jake performs his walk-around inspection with the calm assurance of a seasoned pilot, far removed from the uncertainty he felt years ago. On the tarmac, Jake is surprised by the appearance of Marcus, his older brother. Once a source of tension and criticism, Marcus has transformed since Flight 1247. Now, supportive and loving, he's even become a frequent passenger on Jake's flights. He explains he cleared his legal schedule to join this anniversary trip, something their mother insisted on. Marcus has changed. The arrogance that once strained their relationship is gone. Inspired by Jake, he created a scholarship fund for aspiring pilots from military families, giving back in a way that mirrors Jake's own journey. Jake learns that Marcus's wife, Jessica, and their 2 children, Sophie and Michael, are already aboard. Sophie, age 6, dreams of becoming a pilot, while 4-year-old Michael remains more enthralled by fire trucks, but enjoys being part of the adventure. Jake treasures this new family bond. Years ago, he never would have imagined being Uncle Jake. On board, Jake walks through the passenger cabin, a ritual he developed post-Flight 1247 to connect with the faces he's responsible for. He spots familiar individuals from that fateful night, former passengers who've come to honor the memory and the journey. One of them is the nurse who helped care for the injured during the emergency. She's now traveling with her husband to celebrate their anniversary in London. Another is the businessman who once panicked over his laptop. Now he calmly explains safety features to his daughter. Even Captain Rodriguez, retired but still respected, is flying today, enjoying the employee perks that come with a distinguished aviation career. Jake stops at seat 23C, where a young woman thanks him for what he did 5 years ago. She reveals herself as the college student who had been petrified during the emergency descent. Now, she introduces herself as Dr. Sarah, a trauma counselor with a doctorate in psychology. Inspired by Jake's calm during the ordeal, she dedicated her life to helping survivors of disasters, plane crashes, building collapses, and more. Her transformation is a powerful example of the lasting ripple effects of that single night. Back in the cockpit, Jake prepares for departure. Sarah Chen, thorough and focused, completes the final checklists. She tells Jake she became interested in flying after reading about Flight 1247 in high school. Her story adds yet another layer of meaning to the legacy of that flight. As they push back from the gate, Jake delivers a heartfelt passenger announcement. He honors the anniversary of Flight 1247, reminding everyone that flying isn't just about getting from point A to point B, it's about community, responsibility, and trust. He tells the passengers, We are not just passengers and crew. We are a community traveling together toward our destination. As they line up on runway 34R, the very same where Flight 1247 once landed in crisis, Jake sees the small granite memorial stone marking the crash site, where ordinary people became heroes, October 15th. Air traffic control clears them for takeoff and offers warm wishes for the anniversary. The Boeing 777 lifts off gracefully, carrying with it nearly 400 passengers, a legacy of heroism and a sense of purpose.
Once at cruising altitude, Jake receives word from the cabin crew Marcus has smuggled a cake aboard. The passengers are throwing a spontaneous celebration in honor of the crew and the milestone. It's a joyful, heartfelt moment that illustrates how shared experiences can unite strangers.
Through the ashes of Flight 1247, Jake and those aboard found not just survival, but purpose. In choosing courage, compassion, and service over fear and regret, they became something more than survivors. They became examples. And that is a legacy worth flying for.